Hello, hi. I'm going to give a talk now about job planning and what it actually says in your contract, what it means. Job planning is probably the most important part of consultant contract is your interaction between yourself and the trust, and it really delineates exactly what your work looks like and also the backup that you get. The talk, I'm going to have to guess, you've got one up on me, you can see how long the talk is. My guess is it's going to be about 30-40 minutes or so I suggest you get yourself a decent cup of tea, sit down, and if you're sitting comfortably, then we'll begin. My name's Mike Henley, I'm a consultant neurological surgeon, and I'm chair of the BMA Consultants Committee Pay Terms and Conditions Subcommittee. We're going to cover quite a bit in the talk. I'm going to go through things one at a time. Some topics are very straightforward. Other areas are flashpoints. I think it's something which, to be fair, I don't think we do brilliantly across England. Nobody can argue with the concept of working out what we're supposed to be doing and how best to do it. It's a very sensible thing, but I don't think we're as good at it as we should be. But we'll go through it one step at a time. There are a couple of important places you need to look to understand how all this applies to you. First thing is your contracts, that bit of paper that you've probably not looked at since you got a job. If you can find your contract, good idea, have a quick look through it. Probably not the germane document, but there will be some elements in the talk which we'll go through, and you might want to see if they're actually in your contract. We should have a national contract. Everybody should have the same contract, but a few places play a bit fast and loose with that and aren't necessarily upfront about it either. Another very important document, and if that's the QR code here, are your terms and conditions. That's separate from your contract, but they apply to us all, and that's the primary document which really controls what's right and wrong and how we should follow these things. There are lots of other bits and bobs out there. There's some joint BMA and NHS employer guidance 2011. I think that's a bit long in the tooth now, and there's some bits of it which we'd probably do differently if we wrote it again. There's guidance on the BMA website, which I'll come to at the end. There's some new NHS England guidance come out recently, which very kindly they shared with us. We made some comments, some changes occurred. Much of it is, or some of it is absolutely fine. There are bits that we didn't agree with, and there are bits that we said that they didn't agree with. So it doesn't in any way represent combined guidance, the new stuff out of NHS England. You will have a local policy on job planning. You might want to search for it on your intranet, but your contract remains still more powerful. And academics will, throughout this, just use the Follett principles as you would do. Planning what people do is clearly a really sensible thing to do. Firstly, in terms of alignment, so we're all trying to achieve the same thing. Secondly, if you're an organisation, an NHS Trust, you really want to work out what does the backlog look like? How many patients are being referred every year? How many clinical sessions do you need to get that sorted out? It's a very sensible thing. And then once you know how many sessions you need to deliver that and to get back to an even keel, you're then going to want to talk to your consultants and have you got enough? Have they got enough clinical time to do it? So it's a sensible thing. However, as I said before, it's not necessarily done brilliantly. And in our recent survey, 62% of consultants felt it was a tool to drive down costs. Now, that's clearly one way of using it. Probably not great, because I think most of us hate inefficiency, and job planning is quite a good way of achieving efficiency and productivity, not as you would think by simply nailing people down, but actually by making sure they've got the resources and the setup to actually do their job. And we'll come to that a bit later on. It also is going to describe how you're going to develop personally and professionally. Things don't stay the same every year. Nobody who's been in a job for some years is going to have the same job plan as the day they started. You're going to be appointed 30-something, retire 60-something. It's a long career, so you need to evolve. And the job plan, it's really important as it's put together that we remember about sustainability and actually being able to survive the job. It doesn't help anybody at all if people take early retirement, move to a different trust, or go to a different country. We need to be sensible and intelligent about this and not think in short-term ways. The job plan itself is a document. It's supposed to be, this is out of the T's and C's, a partnership approach. So it's not something which is given to you and then you have to accept it. It must be a matter for discussion and agreement. Typically, a draft is prepared by your clinical manager, and even more typically, that'll be done by a non-clinical manager and then sent through to you these days, often using job planning software. And there should be an annual review. You're going to agree the programme activities, that's what PA stands for, objectives and supporting resources, and we'll go through these as the talk proceeds. A full-time consultant is on 10 PAs, so that's 40 hours, and lunch times are not unpaid, unlike Agenda for Change, that's why they're on 37.5, and that's clearly 10 4-hour PAs, but there are exceptions, obviously. Premium time traditionally is paid at time and a third, so you might be a full-timer on less than 10 PAs because those ones count for more. If, like many of us, probably 61% of us are on 12-ish PAs, what's really important is during the job planning process is that we identify what are the extra sessions, so that if the employer decides they don't want to pay you for 12 anymore, or you decide you don't want to do 12 anymore, we need to know in advance which ones are going to be stopped. Otherwise, it can lead to a very, very, very long discussion. Programmed activities can be divided up into a number of different categories. Here are the 5, and we'll go through them one at a time. Direct clinical care, DCC, that is the kind of central meat and drink of being a consultant, being a doctor in general terms. It's not all of being a consultant. There's a very important other element, which I'll come to next, but anything to do with a named patient, list clinic, shift, MDT, any of the rest of it, patient admin, all of that is by definition going to be direct clinical care. The next one is supporting professional activities. If you had a job plan which was just 10 DCC, you are not working as a consultant, because a consultant must be a leader within their service. All of us should be leaders. All of us should be looking out for where things aren't working, how they can be improved as part of a kind of continuous improvement, Kaizen type approach. All of us should be involved in training, medical education, some formal teaching. We all should be auditing. We're all going to need to do some job planning, appraisal, all the rest of it. All of those things are really important. One of the things that gets haggled about a lot is how many SBAs should I have? Now, first thing to say about this is that all this stuff about core SBAs, it is not contractual. There's nothing in your T's and C's and nothing in your contract about core SBAs either. There are only SBAs. But there was so much trouble in terms of the interviews for consultants across all of the colleges that the academy got together to say, let's pontificate about this and decide how many are appropriate. This is an old document, I'll tell you the date in a second. And what they said was, and this document was pre-revalidations, it said, at present, before the introduction of medical revalidation, those colleges that have estimated the minimum time required solely for a consultant to keep up to date have suggested 1 or 1.5 SBAs. That's solely keeping up to date. This does not include the agreed annual study leave allowance. So those will be numbers that you would have heard from your trust probably. However, the very next paragraph says, in view of the uncertainty around revalidation discussed above, the Academy therefore proposes that the minimum number of SBAs allowed for this purpose, so just keeping up to date, should be 1.5 per week, not including annual study leave. They didn't leave it there, however, and again, I think this is really worth reading out. However, a contract that includes only 1.5 SBAs and 8.5 programmed activities would have no time at all for other SBA work, such as teaching, training, research, service development, clinical governance, contribution to management, etc. It is unthinkable that a consultant could be employed with absolutely no involvement in management, if only attendance at departmental meetings, reading and responding to messages from management, etc. Similarly, it's difficult to envisage a post that never involves any teaching or training of any sort. Most NHS employers receive funding for undergraduate and postgraduate teaching, and let me tell you, a lot of that, and should be able to explain how this is used. A post that does not permit any involvement in service development or clinical governance would be contrary to our concept of the consultant role. I totally agree with that. From this, it follows that 1.5 SBAs in total would be inadequate and that the original recommendation, the consultant contract of 2.5 SPAs as typical, seems reasonable. Now, one of the little tricks we often play for new starters is we say, well, look, you're new, you won't be doing very much, we're just going to give you 1.5, see how it goes. That's very, very tricky. They argued against this, and I think they're right to argue against it. Once you start doing clinics and lists, it's really, really difficult to give them up, and you're not going to get that time back again. What's more, somebody at the beginning of their career may just be just as interested in management service improvement. They may want to have more time to be mentored, etc. So it would be wrong to keep it. It also pointed out that if a consultant is employed with 2 or fewer SPAs, any problems with revalidation should lead to an urgent review of SPA allocation. So when you get those letters from your medical director to say, why on earth haven't you done your appraisal? If you're on 1.5, they've kind of got their answer, haven't they? Here's a link to the document. It's from 2010, and as I said, and as they said, appraisal and revalidation had not been introduced at that point. That didn't come in until 2 years later. And at that point as well, mandatory training was just a fire lecture and a CPR session. It's not the huge industry it is now. So 2.5 would seem like not enough. This, if you've managed to find your contract in your filing cabinet, dust it down. This is what it should say, paragraph 7.3. This is the national model contract that essentially everybody should have. And I shall read it again. Subject to the provisions for recognising emergency work arising from on-call rotas below, the schedule in your job plan will typically include an average of 7.5 programmed activities for direct clinical care duties and 2.5 programmed activities for supporting professional activities. Where your agreed level of duties in relation to supporting professional activities, additional responsibilities, remember that, and other duties is significantly greater or lower than 2.5 programmed activities, there will be local agreement as the appropriate balance between these activities. Part-time consultants need to devote proportionally more of their time to supporting professional activities. This should be agreed on an individual basis. So that's quite characteristic. Now, why was it 2.5 anyway? Where did it come from? So a little bit of contractual history. The pre-2003 contract just had 6 notional half days of clinical work. So when I started on that, it was 4 lists and 2 clinics, and then a bit of time for admin, a bit of time for on-call. So it was 5 to 7, between 5 and 7 really. The rest was for you to use as you wanted. So there was certainly, you were not doing 9 clinical sessions and then 1 of other stuff. The first version of the contract, which was sent out to be voted on, had a split actually based on age. So if you're an older consultant, you got 3 SPAs. If you were younger, you got 2. It was one of the things that caused an absolute furore. Wales kept 3 SPAs. One of the things which it might be worth exploring is if you want to have 2.5, it would be, I think it would be fairly reasonable to ask to be typical and to ask your employer, your CD, to find you some work to do. If it's still a no, it's amenable to mediation and appeal, as we'll discuss later on. We think, the BMA thinks, and I think all right-minded consultants should think that SPAs are important. They are the time that we should be using to improve productivity, change your service, talk to the broader members of the MDT about what's going on. They are completely the professional glue, and they provide job sustainability. Without them, if they get cut, you will struggle to stand a 35-year career in the NHS, and the NHS will suffer. This category is not going to apply to everybody. Additional NHS responsibilities, it's for the sort of big jobs in a hospital. Clinical director, lead clinician, maybe lesser, director of public health, those sorts of things. Things which aren't going to fit into just 2.5 along with everything else. They need to have their own little category, and that's where they go in additional NHS responsibilities. External duties, that's going to be reasonable quantities of work for the Royal Colleges. And it's basically because if you're doing something which benefits the NHS, that is absolutely reasonable. Clearly, most of your work is going to be for your trust, but doing things that are going to benefit people in terms of quality, education, all the rest of it should be supported. They do need to be agreed. So you need to tell your clinical lead or clinical director about them and get agreement to do it. However, they also should be paid. There is nothing in the contract that suggests that this time that you spend is some sort of hobby. We are not missionaries. This is not charity work. If you are doing work that improves the quality of the NHS, it has to be funded by the NHS. Again, mediation, appeal. If you need letters of support, here's a QR code for it. This one just goes to a letter signed by the 4 chief medical officers of the nations, which says just how important it is that people are released for these important duties. We'll talk again about mediation appeal later. There's another category, trade union duties. That's not going to apply to everybody. Two bodies which not that many people, or not everybody knows about. LNC, that's a local negotiating committee, and then every hospital is going to have some version of an MSC, so medical staff committee, something along those lines. Plato said, price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men. I'm not sure that there are many evil people in the NHS, but certainly the money's tight, and it's important that people make sure that things are done fairly and properly. LNC is part of that negotiating mechanism with the employer to make sure that any policies that come in are applied with balance. That's local negotiating committee. Every trust has got one, and if you search for them on the BMA, we'll have a list of who's on it, so you can find them. Paid time off. If you find yourself on an LNC, I'd really encourage people to contribute. There's some great people out there, very clear-sighted and good at this stuff that think they may be too busy, or what's the point. Paid time off, reasonable time off for this stuff is a right under the law. And trade union duties are really about negotiating anything to do with pay, terms and conditions, which employee does what in the hospital, how those employees are managed, etc., how you are managed, facilities, all those sorts of things. Secretaries being taken away, that's all trade union stuff. And as an accredited trade union representative, you have to be given time for it, and it's definitely not SPA time. Really encourage people not to just keep their head down. We as a group, we are hugely powerful. We just need to be much better at standing together. As I said, each hospital will probably have a medical staff committee or similar. Sometimes they've been stood down, sometimes they're in abeyance. Make sure you have one, because actually your local negotiating committee's power comes from the medical staff committee and the fact that people are engaged, and if not, form one, make one and get it going. And that corresponds not just to trade union work, but all work. I'd encourage all people that are consultants to be engaged in various forms of improvement and other work. I think it's important. Now, what are the nuts and bolts of all of this? So a job plan is an agreement between your consultant and your clinical manager or clinical lead. It is a prospective document. It's about what you're going to do next year. Now, sometimes you won't have done it the year before. It's going to change. Sometimes there'll be discussions about whether you really need the time. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But in fact, it is a prospective document. You do not have to have anybody else in the room. So some trusts will say, we're going to put your clinical director in there and we're going to send the non-clinical manager, and then you'll be sat opposite them. There is no compunction to have anybody else in the room apart from your clinical lead or clinical manager. And it's interesting that only 35% of consultants had never felt pressurised or intimidated in a job planning meeting. And once you look at the whole process, that drops to 31%. So less than a third of people haven't felt pressurised or intimidated. That's not ideal, really, is it? My way of handling it, and our suggestion is that you, as the non-clinical managers, are very welcome to come and set the scene, tell you what the problems are, but then should leave at that point when you actually get down to discussing your job plan. Do not be outnumbered. It's a difficult place to be. According to the contract, so contractually, once you have agreed a job plan with the other person in the room with you, your clinical lead, your job plan is contractually signed off. Lots of trusts have multiple levels of this, and lots of us have had trusts where or been in trusts where our job plan just disappears into the too difficult box. Theoretically, if it's signed off by your clinical lead, it is signed off. That's the end, as per contract. Keep information about all of this stuff. Keep details. There is no such thing as team job planning. Let me say that again. There is no such thing as team job planning. There is team service planning. That's different. So nobody should be sat down and being told this is exactly what you're going to do, because a job plan is an agreement between a single person and your employer. It clearly makes a whole heap of sense to work out what your service needs to deliver and roughly how you're going to do that. But that doesn't mean to say you're signing up to it as a team for everybody to be the same. There may be variation there, and that may be reasonable. Some people would like to annualise. Now, annualisation means that you are going to sign up, and this is if you agree to do it, you're going to sign up to provide a certain number of sessions per year. So variations might be you might just work term time and not do anything during holidays, school holidays, but you will be delivering X number of sessions during the course of the year. That's annualisation. Both parties need to agree to it, you and the employer. Beware, however, of what we call pseudo-annualisation. I'll come back to that in a second. If there are difficulties, it is well worth, or you think there may be difficulties, well worth keeping a diary actually. So just keep a diary of what you do for 4 weeks. Employers can ask people to keep diaries as well, so that everybody knows exactly what's going on, and it's got some science behind it rather than a finger in the air. I think that's sensible. Units of time. When the contract was first produced and accepted, and all the guidance came out, there was a diary produced, and in the diary the minimum recordable time was 30 minutes, and that was accepted at the time by NHS employers as part of joint guidance. So we shouldn't be recording 3 minutes or something. It's a bit like the lawyers, the billable quantity of time for the contract is 30 minutes. A section which often isn't covered very well, and I think that may change in the future, is the objectives section. Often it's either ignored or not updated. The objectives, and this is in your contract, must be reasonable and must be agreed, must reflect the phases of a consultant's career. Everyone's going to be a bit different. It's really important that you can meet the objectives. Do not set yourself stretch objectives. This isn't appraisal where that's maybe a good idea. This is something which, if you do not meet those objectives, you may not get pay progression. That's a serious thing. So make sure that you agree to things you can deliver. Now, if you can't agree to them between you and your clinical lead, then you're going to be going on to mediation and appeal, which we'll discuss in a second. What we suggest that you definitely do not agree to, is something which looks like this. If you are asked to sign up to delivering 42 weeks of the year, 44 sessions per year for each element of your job plan. So, for example, let's say Monday morning you have a clinic and you're asked to sign up to delivering 42 or 44 clinics over the course of a year. It's going to go into an e-roster, it's going to be counted up, and then if you don't deliver, people will ask you to repay them or do them. Do not sign up to that unless you absolutely want to, because that represents annualisation, but without the ability to say, I've completed them, I'm doing no more. So it's a one-way ratchet. You cannot be made to do this. The only way that you can sign up for annualisation is by your agreement. That's why it's separately in the contract. This is a sort of back door to try and make that happen. Do not accept it. Do not agree to it. Another section which is ignored, actually I might go back, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back to talk about that a bit more. The reason that's important, because you might superficially hear people say, well, that's fair, why shouldn't you deliver it? People may be shirkers, or, there's always someone else who's a shirker, isn't there? It's actually, when you keep a diary, it's incredibly hard to do these things. Let me give you a scenario. You're an anaesthetist, I'm not a urologist, but you're an anaesthetist, you're in charge of preoperative assessment. You've signed up for 44 Monday mornings or something. Just imagine you've got the typical, if someone's given you 1.5 SPAs, they've given you 0.25 for being lead for preoperative assessment or something. It definitely doesn't fit in the 0.25. You've done a diary and you're doing way more than that, but you're not being given it. It's not beyond the possibility that the meeting that's deciding that they're going to cancel all preoperative assessment and sack all the nurses is going to be at the time when you're doing a list. Now, clearly, you need to attend that. So you need to drop that list and you need to go and do it. If you're only being paid 0.25 PAs and it's not going to cover that, and you've got to pay back your list, all that is going to happen is you are going to be paying back that in your own time. So you will pay out of your own pocket to go to that meeting. So in the same way that we shouldn't be being paid twice, quite similarly, we shouldn't be paid like not at all. That's a bad thing. Back to this section now, resources and environment. This is quite often ignored, and it's actually a really, really important thing. So none of us can be productive, can we, without the supporting resources we need. And the job plan is where these need to be discussed and again agreed. So what that means is, for example, say you've got a PA and somebody says, we're going to get rid of all the PAs, we're replacing all the PAs with digital dictation, and somebody offshore is going to organise the PA duties. If you don't like that, you don't need to accept it because it's part of your contract. Your job plan is part of your contract, a temporary part for a year, but it's already part of your contract. So it needs to be, that change needs to be with your agreement. It's pretty broad. So you might be things around wards. Those are resources that you need. Theatres, clinics, porters, preoperative assessment, office space, PA, and then other members of staff that might support you. You've got a lot of power there, and I don't think we use it enough. Now, since the contract was agreed back in 2003, I think we'd all agree a lot's changed. We need to look a little bit at the concepts underlying in the contracts. Plain time, what's that? Premium time, unpredictable on call, and predictable on call. Just to take the first two, in the contract, plain time, there's a lot of it. It's 7 in the morning until 7 at night. Anything in that time is plain time. You can be asked to work in that time, and there's no way you can say no. You've just got to do it. Premium time is between 7 in the evening and 7 in the morning, and all day Saturday and Sunday. Different restrictions around that, which we'll come to in a second. Let's look at these other bits and bobs. So, emergency work. Important to understand about emergency work. 2 types. Predictable emergency work. This is emergency work that takes place at regular and predictable times, often as a consequence of a period of on-call work, e.g. post-take ward rounds. This should be programmed into the working week as scheduled programmed activity. Unpredictable emergency work arising from on-call duties. This is work done whilst on-call and associated directly with the consultant's on-call duties, except insofar as it takes place during a time for scheduled programme activities, e.g. recall to hospital to operate on an emergency basis. And we'll just explore that in a second. For the purposes of Schedule 3, Paragraph 6, that's coming up shortly, non-emergency work should be regarded as including the regular programmed work of consultants whose specialty by its nature involves dealing routinely with emergency cases, e.g. A&E consultants. Now that's a bit broader now than it was. So one of the things which has crept in is the use of predictable emergency work at the weekends. So they'll say, well, you're going to do a list all day as predictable emergency work, or you're going to do a ward round on a Saturday morning, regularly put into your rota as predictable emergency work as part of your working week. That is not the standard working week. The standard working week is plain time, and that's why it's been delineated as separate in your contract. Let's have a little look at 2 areas of the contract which explain that. Schedule 3, Paragraph 6. Non-emergency work after 6 p.m. and before 7 a.m. during weekdays or at the weekends will only be scheduled by mutual agreement between consultant and his or her clinical manager. Consultants will have the right to refuse non-emergency work at such times. Should they do so, there will be no detriment in relation to pay progression or any other matter. So say you're an orthopaedic surgeon, you've got a trauma list on a Saturday, it's booked, it's elective, the patients who are at home and then called back in for the trauma list, that's routine work. The trust needs to reach agreement with you about the terms of that, whether you'll do it and what the rate of pay is, or the time off in lieu associated with it, or any other matter. Best done as a department probably, but actually that applies to an individual because it's your extra contractual work. The next bit, well, they might say, well, hold on, this is an emergency. This is emergency work. It's a busy emergency list. Now you're an anaesthetist and you're doing an emergency list and you're in all day Saturday. This is Schedule 8, Paragraph 4, where unusually a consultant is asked to be resident at the hospital or other place of work during his or her on-call period. Appropriate arrangements may be agreed locally. A consultant will only be resident during an on-call period by mutual agreement. Hold on, that says that I don't have to do that either. Now, my point would be that all of us want to provide a high quality service. There is no doubt about that. But at the moment, premium time is paid at time and a third. That was okay when what we were doing was on an ad hoc basis coming in, advising the senior registrar what to do, and then nipping back home again on a Saturday. That is not the way we're working now. Just to even look at Agenda for Change. Agenda for Change staff, they're on 1.5 times for their premium time work. So for us to be on time and a third is inappropriate. In fact, I think 1.5 times is inappropriate too. And it's absolutely up to you to get together and decide what your rate of pay is, or talk to your LNC, etc., and come up with a rate of pay or time off in lieu for doing that work. If you work lots of time during a Saturday, so you do 12 hours, you may push for agreement that you are going to do 2 hours as a PA and you want that time back, because you must agree to do that. They must get your agreement. So examples of this sort of extra contractual work: premium time trauma lists, etc., or lists, premium time ward rounds. Even if it's not in your job plan as a session where you have to be there, if you are regularly so busy that you cannot leave the building, that's exactly the same. It still counts as extra contractual work. If you're expected to be in the building when on call for emergencies list, if you're a radiologist or a microbiologist, you spend your whole time next to a computer answering calls throughout the day, that's exactly the same thing. That would also count as extra contractual duties. Scheduled direct clinical care shifts in premium time, same if you're an ED, that's extra contractual. Rota gaps, how about that? Colleague disappears, someone's off sick, short-term sick, going to cover that for 72 hours. After that, extra contractual agreements needed. So there's a lot of extra contractual stuff in there which shouldn't just be plonked into your job plan. Another thing which needs thinking about when you're doing your job plan is, what do we do after I've been on call? So what happens quite a bit, I think, around the country is that you're on call and then the next day people cancel your clinical activity. So you did have a 4-hour list the next day or something, and it's just cancelled. If you think about it, what's going on there is you're being paid some not very substantial amount of money for being available. You're called, let's say you're called 4 times in the night, each time for half an hour. You've got no sleep. Your weekly PA for being on call will be a bit like half a PA maybe for that element of it, not including the weekend. But each time you're on call, you lose a whole PA of being in the hospital. You're actually paying to deliver the on-call work. That makes no sense at all. So no activity the day after being on call is problematic. What's much more appropriate actually is that not many of us are in a situation where it happens all the time. So a much better way to tackle that is that the day after someone is on call, put in a predictable emergency session, because that will be in the working week. It's going to be Monday to Friday. So you're on call Monday, next morning, predictable emergency session. If you're not bothered too much, you come in, you're an extra pair of hands on the on-call, you can help mop things up. If you are called and you need to sleep in as compensatory rest, then it's not unpaid, it's not at your cost. As I said, there are other things to think about with the extra contractual stuff. If you're on extra contractual stuff and it's not working out, extra contractual stuff can be stopped. So you can just stop doing it. It's extra contractual. You don't absolutely need to give notice, but I think it is always sensible to give notice, and we'd normally say 3 months. There is always a slight interplay between stuff that needs to be done and professional matters. So saying I'm not doing it from tomorrow, I think, is impossible for the employer. So I think it is sensible and professional to give the employer plenty of notice to sort it out. But certainly 3 months, as per other parts of the contract, would be very sensible and enough. It's the employer's responsibility to run the service, not absolutely yours. So it's important that you value your time and your extra contractual stuff. It doesn't matter if the resident work, this little summary for this section, doesn't matter if the resident work is recorded as such or if it's just simply so busy. If you're at home, the same applies. Your LNC should be able to advise you on the rates that you should regard as a minimum to negotiate, and we in our turn can support LNCs with what these rates should be. What we can't do is we can't have a national rate card at the moment. What happens if you want to change your existing job plan? This may be you've just started and you've got a job plan and it's not suitable, or you may just discover that the one you agreed to actually isn't working out and you need a change. So either side, you or your clinical lead or clinical director, can ask for a job plan review at any time. Again, it should be in the spirit of cooperation. If you're doing extra contractual sessions, then those can just be cancelled. You don't need to do those. And in fact, it's worth remembering that if you're doing PAs more than 10, those are the cheapest PAs for the employer. They're much cheaper, so you are probably better off selling that work back if it's clinical work, which is again why it's really important to work out which are the additional sessions. If it's something the employer is relying on and it's very difficult to stop, again think about a notice period. Recommendation maybe 3 months, but there's no absolute contractual reason to do that. And if you want to change your job plan and there's a refusal on the other side, then we will come to the mechanisms for that. The first step, if you can't agree, is mediation. And I think the consultant body as a whole is a bit nervous about this, but I think it's really important to realise that it's pretty impossible for us to all agree what should be an agreed job plan. So we would expect there to be a need for mediation and appeals, and I do not think we do this enough. I don't think we do it anywhere near enough. So if you don't agree with your job plan, you don't need to accept it. You just say, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. Let's put it up for mediation plus or minus appeal. Either side can call for mediation, and both sides should state their reasons for failure to agree. You write it. It's got to be done within 2 weeks of the job planning meeting. You send an email stating it to the medical director, and the medical director or their nominee has got 4 weeks to adjudicate and write back. If there's still no agreement, you still haven't managed to agree, and there may be a meeting. Often there's a meeting. If there's still no agreement, then the next stage is formal appeal. So you get the thing back, the judgment from the medical director. You look at it and you say, "This is ridiculous. I don't agree with it." The first thing you need to do is within 2 weeks is write to the CEO and say, "Unfortunately, I don't agree with the mediation outcome from my job plan. I'd like to go to formal appeal." It's got to be within 2 weeks. And what will happen is a chair will be nominated by the organisation, a panel member will be nominated by the consultant, a third person from a central list, to which some are management people and some are BMA people. And you can have challenge of the third person around things like they've already been involved, etc. So panel members must not have been involved already. I can't emphasise enough that you should, if you're listening to this and you're not in a trade union, when you finish this, join a trade union, honestly, because you don't want to be having problems with your job plan and things and then trying to join a trade union, because like all insurance, you can't crash your car and then phone up afterwards and say, can I have some insurance? So you've got to do it in advance. When it comes to the appeal, if it's something to do with your specialty experts can be called. Both sides are going to present some evidence. It's a good idea if you've kept a diary and you've got something to back up what you're going to say. Consultants really regularly win. While the result isn't contractually binding for a job plan review, it is for pay progression, but not for a job plan review. Trusts nearly always comply. So it's not something that's going to not happen. So this is basically the end of it. Maybe I sent you away too early, but I think that appeal and mediation bit's really important to understand. The summary is both sides need to understand what's expected and why it's important. And I think without job planning, really looking at resources as well as what people are doing, we are not going to get to the level of productivity we need. It's really important. It must not be used as a tool to sort of force people to drive down their PAs. That's completely the wrong way to look at it. Our pay progression depends on those objectives that we set. It's your opportunity to make sure you're paid for what you do. Like I said, you're not a charity. Make sure that you're being paid. It's quite absolutely reasonable to be paid for the work that you do. So ensure that happens. Make sure that you've got the resources you need. Don't let people take things away from you. Make your job more and more impossible. We want people to be working as a consultant, not as your own PA or doing some administration, filing the stuff that should have been filed before clinic and chasing results, etc. There should be people to do that for you. Don't be afraid to push the mediation appeal button if your job plan isn't making progress or it's a bit too difficult. Further information here. Here's the QR code, and all the very best with it. Can I ask people to put comments in the section below? Do put comments in. I'll keep an eye on it rather than answering them below. What I'll probably do is actually we might set up a little podcast, and we'll have a bit of a natter about the questions that come up, because usually it's best as a discussion. Good luck with your job planning. This will probably be refreshed at regular intervals. I'll probably redo it again with some proper branding, etc., and following comments that people send in. Do hope it's been helpful. Keep in touch. All the best. Take care. Good night.